I'd like to call to order the regular meeting of the City of Oak Harbor Planning Commission, January 24, 2017. Let the record show that all commissioners are present this evening. Second item on our agenda is the approval of the minutes, December 13th. Do I have a motion?
I'll make the motion to approve the December 13th, 2016 Planning Commission minutes.
Second?
I will second it.
Okay. I have a motion, a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I abstain because
abstain.
I was not here. And Eric. Third item is the part of our meeting where we set aside 15 minutes for any comments that are not otherwise on the agenda from the public. Seeing no public this evening, I will close that part of our meeting. Item 4 is public hearings and meetings. The first item is a public hearing, the annual comprehensive plan amendment, and Senior Planner Kak Kamak will lead us through this.
Good evening, thank you. Kamak, Senior Planner, to present the 2017 Comprehensive Plan amendments. We do this every year. We actually didn't do it last year because we did the 2016 update, which was the major update to the comprehensive plan. But these are annual amendments we do every year. So I'll go through and describe the process. We've had commissioners here that have been involved in this process since we began doing this, but we also have new members, so I'll go through the process so you can be familiar with it. So the RCWs allows comprehensive plans for cities and counties to be amended only once a year, so you can't do more than one amendment. So we get requests for comprehensive plan amendments, and so we compile them all and try to do it in one sweeping process. So we've codified the process in chapter 1815, and basically the process starts in October of every year. We advertise to the community saying that we have comprehensive plan amendment applications. If you have any suggestions, usually there were land use changes in the past, but we've amended the code, and I'll present some information later on in the rezoning aspect of what was the change there. But for commissioners that were here in the past, you know that we've had land use changes and requests that come. Basically, if somebody wants to rezone their property, they have to do the land use amendment first, and that's a comprehensive plan change, and they have to go through this entire process before they come and actually get the property rezoned. So those were usually the applications that we get, but other things can come through. We've had Planning Commission recommend studies to be added for comprehensive plan changes, like scenic view corridors were considered under that, and we've done some other projects. So the application deadline is December 1st. This year we haven't received any private or sponsored applications. So in the month of December, we compile all of those amendments, we advertise them, and we have a public hearing with the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission looks at the preliminary docket and then makes a recommendation to the City Council. And the City Council looks at it and finalizes that docket in March. And then staff works on it for the beginning of the year, you know, from April to probably August, September. In that time frame, we'll have public hearings regarding some of these items, collect public information or public input on them. And then when we get into October and November, we start bringing those amendments for hearings before the Planning Commission, and then the City Council takes action on them in November, December. So this process has started, and here we are at the preliminary docket stage. So the Planning Commission is going to look at the preliminary docket, and then hopefully, and you're required by our ordinance to forward them to the City Council before the end of this month. So this is the public hearing for that. So what do we have on the 2017 docket? We have an update to the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan. This plan was approved in 2000. The last one was adopted in 2009, It's a 6-year lifespan for that, for the plan according for state officials and for grant eligibility. And we're past the 6 years, so it's time for us to update the plan so that we could be eligible for grant funding. So that is one of the elements that we'll be updating this year. The capital improvements plan, that's one of the elements that we update every year. We look at the projects, we look at the schedule, and we see what has changed and whether we need to shift the schedule or shift dollar amounts. So we look at that almost every year. We also have the environmental element. Now, if you remember, when we did the 2016 update, the state did require us to also adopt development regulations for critical areas. And we got an extension because we had some more work to do in that, in the critical areas section. So we've got a 12-month extension, and Dennis is going to provide some information and briefing on that later at this meeting. But we are thinking that the adoption process and the discussion could potentially bring up some policy changes in the environmental section. And so we've kind of included in the docket so that when we get to the end of the year, we can take those changes and plug them into the comprehensive plan and update it as part of this year's update. The last item is the economic development element. And this is something that, again, we put it on the docket to keep it open for potential changes. There are some discussions from the mayor's office and the city administration's office that are in continuing discussion with with community partners on trying to develop strategies to bring more economic development opportunities to Oak-Harbor. And so we'll be monitoring that, and if there are any policy changes that we have to consider based on that, then we have this open and we can include some of the changes here and discuss how that impacts the overall city's comprehensive plan. So these are the 4 items that are currently on the docket. Our code requires us to kind of look at them and review them against a set of criteria. Some of them may apply to what we have on the docket, some of them may not, because they're supposed to address those private development applications as well. So we'll just go ahead and look at some of the criteria. I've just listed the criteria. The amendments, you want the amendments to be consistent with the Growth Management Act and the countywide planning policies. You want the proposal to not contradict any other elements of the comprehensive plan policies. You want to see if it implements. You want to look at opportunities for implementing existing goals within the plan. You want to see if you want to correct any inconsistencies. Is this proposal correcting something? Some of them aren't. This won't apply to us for this year's, but you want to have that option. You want to see if the amendments are clearly defined. Are they vague? Can it be really done within a year or 2? Do we know fully well what we're getting into? Is the amendment an expressed desire of the community? I mean, the scenic views is a great example. It's a desire for the community to move that forward. So is this something part of that? And would the public interest be served by considering it at this time? There's many amendments that the commission and the city council and staff can take on, but is this the right time to take it on? So those are some of the criteria that the code lists for us to check on. So I apologize, that looked better on my monitor, but not so well on the screen. But I do have this table in your packet as well. Basically, we review all the proposed docket items against the criteria in a table form so that it's easy to read. I won't go through them in detail. I think all the amendments that we have on there meet the criteria or they're not applicable because we don't have any sponsored amendments. So what we'd like the Planning Commission to do is open the public hearing, conduct the public hearing. There's no public here, but if there were public here, I would say take comments from them. But if you have any questions or anything that you'd like to discuss, we're happy to address those. And at the end of the hearing, we'd like the Planning Commission to make a recommendation to the City Council. Questions, thoughts?
Seeing none, I will, at this point, open the public hearing for the annual comprehensive plan amendments. Seeing no audience this evening, I suspect that I can now close the public hearing. Do I have a recommendation or motion in the form of a recommendation?
I move that we recommend that the city council approve the proposed docket for the 2017 comprehensive plan amendments.
We have a motion. Do I have a second?
I second motion.
Okay, the motion's made and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Passes. The next item on the agenda is the 2016 Planning Commission Annual Report to the City. Development Services Director Steve Powers has this and will walk us through that.
Thank you, Chairman Wassinger. It's my pleasure to discuss with you your annual report to the City Council. As you know, we put this together for you on your behalf to help you organize your report that goes to the Commission. Categories we've taken to standardizing those over the last few years. They are your accomplishments for the past year, what we anticipate being your work program for the coming year. There is a section which is in there for recommendations from you to the City Council. We do not presume to fill that one in for you. And then finally, your fourth section of the report is really the details of your actions from last year. Of course, the council is well aware of the fine work that the Planning Commission does because as we send items to them that come through this body, we always include a section in this agenda bill that shows what work you've done, what your recommendation was. They always have copies of your minutes as well, sometimes in draft form, sometimes as adopted. So they're well aware of the deliberations that you go through. But this is a nice, concise way to keep them up to speed on your annual activities. It's also required by our code, which is why we do that. And so really there's not much more from the staff perspective. The part that again, we didn't fill in for you is the section 3 recommendations that you'd like to make to the City Council. If you have ideas about that this evening, that would be great. We'd be happy to make note of them. We'll revise the report and bring it back to you next month. If not, and it's something you wanted to mull over, we could take those comments from you probably for about 2 weeks from tonight. And that would still give us a chance to get it into the draft document so that you could see it before your next meeting. If that's how you'd like to proceed, you could send those comments either to me or you can send them to Lisa, and we'd be sure to get them plugged into your draft report. I'd be happy to help you with any questions you might have.
I think it's a very good report, Steve. You really laid it out well this year. And I just want to thank you and your staff. I know a couple of years ago you didn't have as many staff members, so there was one of the things we did ask for is for more staff for you, and I think you've done a pretty good job filling
Well,
those.
thank you. In fact, Ray doesn't probably know this, but that's why Ray is here, is
Yeah.
because the Planning Commission said, gosh, it looks like we're doing an awful lot, and we don't have a lot of places to spread that work around. So Ray thanks you for for the position being created. And I also want to say that I'm taking absolutely no credit for the preparation of this report. This work was all Lisa's work. She compiled it. She put it in front of me. She said, read it before this particular date. And I just barely got my part of the job done. So really, Lisa was responsible for the work for you this evening.
Well, from my standpoint is that, Lisa's part of your staff.
Oh, yes.
And so she's a very vital member of your staff, and thank you, Lisa. We appreciate it, but from my perspective, and I just appreciate you and the staff and your guidance, to coach us through some of this stuff.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure, and I think I can say that on behalf of the rest of the staff as well. So if you have things you want us to include tonight, please let us know. Otherwise, send me or Lisa an email or just give us a call on the phone. We'll be happy to take those down. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Any further discussion? The next item is code amendments to consider rezoning requests. This is a public meeting, and Senior Planner Kat Kamek will take this on.
Thank you. Again, CACMAC Senior Planner. We just wanted to introduce this topic to the Planning Commission and start a discussion on this. We do this with a lot of our agenda items to give a chance for the Commission to get up to speed on what's coming. And also if public, if they're here, they can listen to it. And the fact that most of the Planning Commission meetings are aired on TV twice a week or even more than that actually helps to get the word out. So this is just an introduction. And where this stems from is actually from our 2016 update. So just as a background, and for commissioners that weren't here at with the 2016 update, prior to the 2016 update, we have so the way rezonings work in the city. So we have a zoning map, which is part of a zoning ordinance, and then we have a land use map, which is part of the comprehensive plan. 2 different documents. And before the 2016 update, we had land use categories. We had 13 to 14 land use categories. And each of those categories transferred into a particular zoning category. So we call it a 1-to-1 ratio. So the future land use map was on a 1-to-1 ratio with the zoning map. And as I mentioned earlier in our comprehensive plan amendment that we did annually, people who wanted to change a zoning would have to first come and change the land use map, and therefore it was a comp plan amendment. They had to go through a year's worth of process on that, and then they would come back and then have the land rezoned under the zoning ordinance and the zoning map. So with the 2016 update, there was we wanted to change the strategy because that we were getting comments from the public property owners that this process is long. We can't do development and redevelopment fast enough because sometimes it can take 2 years. So if you missed the December 1st deadline and you came in on January 1st and said, I want to rezone the property, you have to wait all the way that year for the application to be open. And so that's a long process. So during the 2016 update, we shifted to a more generalized land use map. So the 13 or 14 land use categories went down to 6 or 7, or the land use categories, but the zoning categories have remained the same. And now there are 3 or 4 zoning categories implementing 1 land use. This makes rezoning different. Now you don't have to, for example, and I have a slide here, I think. There you go. So, so that's the 2016 prior. For the 2016 update, for example, we have now a low-intensity residential land use category in our comprehensive plan, and that is implemented by 3 zoning categories, R1, R2, and R3. And so for rezonings, if somebody wants to rezone their property from R1 to R2, they don't have to go and change the land use designation. They can do it under the rezoning process, which is still a planning commission public hearing. Well, it depends. It could be a hearing examiner as well. But it's a 2-3 month process as opposed to a year-long process, and it can be done at any time of the year. You don't have to wait for anything specific. So we changed that. In order to implement that, we have to make some changes to our existing code on how to do rezonings. So the existing code is written for the old style. And the type of language that's written in there is still a little restrictive in terms of how people can rezone it. So, so we're looking at ways to try and keep with the intent of why we changed to a generalized land use map and give options to property owners to make changes and react to market trends faster than before. So we have to consider some amendments, and that's what this topic is all about. So in order to consider what other changes that we should make, I just want to go through and briefly describe how our current language works. And this is just a summary. So the current language is designed for map amendments to align with comprehensive plan designation. So, you know, you had the old 1-to-1 ratio, but you did have a few zoning properties that were not in line with the comp plan designations, and so they could be rezoned. So there was very narrow window on who could do rezones. The current language also required development applications to come along with the rezoning. So what this required is the developer to invest early in the process to develop plans, not knowing fully whether they'll get the rezoning or not. So there was some unsureness in there, and that probably limited the number of rezoning applications we got. I think in the time I've been here, there may have been one, maybe, rezoning application. So there was minimum. The process was just challenging in that way. The ordinance also had provisions for conditions and restrictions to be placed, you know, and then because you were putting conditions and restrictions on a rezoning, then you had to write a lot of language in on how those would change, because sometimes development is 4 or 5 years down the road, things change, and all of a sudden, you know, you want to make changes in your development proposal, then you have to consider, is it major, minor, should we go back through the process? So you had to have language for all of that. And there were also provisions for contract zoning, which allowed for use restrictions and increase or restricting density and so on. So there was a lot of layers to a rezoning request. So when somebody came in for a proposal, there was a lot of investment they had to do, develop plans, and then the city would review it, and then there would be conditions placed, and it was a really lengthy process, and we're trying to simplify all of that with the new language. So the drawback, invest early in the process, probably a SEPA was required because the development proposal was in that, and that was probably used for mitigations and restrictions as well. Restrictions ran with the land, it was an ordinance, and it becomes really difficult to redevelop. You know, sometimes these tools are great to get a development started, but time passes by and things change, and when it's time to change, the more restrictions and documents you have on a certain property, the more difficult it is to deal with the system and the process. So what are some of the things that we're hoping to consider for the new language? Want to recognize rezonings as either being legislative or quasi-judicial. So, for example, if we had one single property owner somewhere in a district come and ask for a rezoning request, we would consider that to be quasi-judicial. It's a single property owner dealing with the development, and quasi-judicial hearings are usually property and development related, and they can go through the hearing examiner process. It's a pretty straightforward, simple. Now, if we have multiple properties, let's say 2 or 3 properties on a street corner want to come together and change the zoning, now the impact gets to be a little larger. Or what if a 20-acre tract of residential is all of a sudden wanting to be commercial? You know, we're losing that 20 acres of inventory in the residential side. And so legislatively, we have to look at some of these issues and impacts. So we have to look at these things. So quasi-judicial, you have a set of things that is pretty strict in terms of you follow this rule and you can get the action. Legislative brings a lot more information in, room for debate. So we want to kind of separate the two and determine what is legislative and what is quasi-judicial. So we want to try and have some language to tackle that difference. And we also want to establish the criteria that determines what's legislative, what's quasi-judicial. We want to look at rezonings based on location and compatibility of the intended zoning classification. So basically so in my previous slide here, let's say, low intensity residential covers R1, R2, R3, and let's say a lot in Fireside is sitting empty for a few years and they say, I want to put a multifamily. Well, it would be so isolated, right, in terms of location. Spot zoning is what that's called, and we want to prevent that because you don't want just anybody getting an R3 zoning on a lot that shouldn't accommodate it. right? Even though it's under the same land use category, you should find a way to write criteria saying that that's not appropriate. But that same request, R1 to R3 in a different area, may be okay. And so we want to do it location-based, and we just don't want to say, just because you're under the same land use category, you automatically get R1 or R3 or whatever it is requesting. So we want to design the criteria based on that. We also want to limit or eliminate rezoning-related conditions and restrictions. And we want to find another way. Now, all rezonings are not going to be straightforward and compatible. There may be issues, but we want to find a way to try and not impose so many restrictions and limitations on a rezoning right off the bat so that later on when they want to do development, that it's so restricted. We want to find another way to do it, and we're still exploring what would be the best way. So we want to kind of look at that, and we want to include language to consider zoning classifications for annexing properties. So that's something that's not addressed in our current code. So for example, properties in the UGA that's not in the city is designated in the future land use map as low intensity. They want to annex into the city. Well, they've got 3 zoning categories to choose from, R1, R2, and R3. And so the normal way we would look at it is you get the lowest zoning classification. And if they want something else, we have to have a way to consider it. And so we want to add some language in here so that we can go through the choices and make an informed decision on which would be the best zoning category when they do come into the city. So those are some of the things that we have in mind with the trying to address the new language. And we just wanted to share that with you and with the public. So that's what we intend to do today. We're not expecting the commission to make any decisions. We don't have any draft language in front of you. The process from here on, this is a type 4 review process to consider code amendments. We'll have to do a SEPA review because it's kind of development regulations. And these amendments will require a public hearing before the Planning Commission and the City Council. The hearings will be noticed in the newspaper. We're not expecting you to take any action today. But if you have any questions or any suggestions or any thoughts regarding it, please let us know, and we'll incorporate that into the draft that we bring forward. We're hoping, I don't have any dates, that we're hoping will come to the next meeting to you with a draft so that we can continue to discuss that. But if there are any other changes, we'll still keep you updated on the schedule. But we're hoping to bring it in front of you within the next month or so. Questions? All right.
Just one quickly.
Absolutely.
In decision criteria 4D, section I, it says the proposed rezone is in the best interest of the residents of the city, and that the applicant must demonstrate the following. That just seems completely subjective to me, and what type of criteria to use to determine what's in the best interest of the residents.
And this is the existing language, right?
Okay.
Yeah, and we will look at those kind of subjective things. Now, in a legislative process, it's okay to have subjective issues because you can bring a lot of information in to make a determination. In a quasi-judicial one, you want to try and narrow it down to something more tangible. But we'll look at all of that, absolutely.
Thank you, Kak.
Thank you.
The next item on the agenda this evening is the Critical Areas Ordinance Update. Senior Planner Dennis Lefevre will take us through this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. Critical areas. I realize this is probably your first touch on this ordinance amendment proposal. So what I'm going to do is just kind of give you a high-level review of essentially what the background is of the critical areas, how it evolved, some of the key steps that the city has taken to be in conformance with the critical areas ordinance update, specifically the 2005 update, which I'll address a little bit later. Address again from a conceptual point of view what we're looking at as far as this current update process, and then also give you an anticipated time frame for this project. As part of the Growth Management Act, which was adopted in 1990 and amended in 1991, one of the 13 goals was to protect the environment and enhance the state's high quality of life, including air and water quality and the availability of water. So the state legislature then implemented through RCW 3670A.170 that all cities and counties in the state of Washington designate and protect resource lands in critical areas. Well, what are resource lands in critical areas? Well, the resource lands are basically all agricultural, forest, and mineral resource lands that aren't characterized by urban development and also have a commercial significance to them. Fortunately, in the city of Oak Harbor, we don't have any resource lands, but we do have critical areas. And again, in RCW 3670A0305, critical areas are defined in 5 basic categories. Wetlands, CARA stands for the Critical Aquifer Recharge Areas, Fish and Wildlife Habitat Conservation Areas, Frequently Flooded Areas, and Geologically Hazardous Areas. I have more of a defined explanation in the staff report of each one of those, so take a look at those. I won't go into any detail at this point in time what each one of those really entails until we get further down in discussion of proposed amendments. So what we are looking at is where the city has taken us and where we are at this point in time as far as looking at the update. We met the requirement of that initial implementation statute of at least designating and protecting our critical areas by the first 2 ordinances that are identified there, 914 and 977. Were adopted well, the permanent critical areas ordinance was adopted in 1994. We subsequently, in 2001, adopted ordinance number 1282, which looked at some of the wetland standards in our mitigation sequencing. That ordinance primarily dealt with wetlands because there was some shifting in the state policy through Department of Ecology that required some different views from a local jurisdiction on how we deal with wetlands in the city. So we adopted ordinance 1282 to be in conformance with the Department of Ecology new rules. Probably the most substantial update that the city has undertaken for critical areas was back in 2005. The state had gone through and done a lot of discussion on, well, if we're going to do critical areas, we should be a little bit more prescriptive on how local jurisdictions look at them, and then also create the regulations to protect them. So before I get to a little bit more detail of 1440, it's kind of interesting to note that under the Fish and Wildlife Habitat Conservation Areas, local jurisdictions are allowed to identify local species of significance. Before we even created the permanent critical areas ordinance, we adopted an ordinance to protect our Gary oak tree. So that was kind of a unique situation for us to move ahead of actually the full set of critical areas ordinance and move ahead and protect our oak trees. So we are going to continue to do that. In 2005, Ordinance 1440, as I mentioned, was the primary effort that we engaged in to continue to update our critical areas in conformance with the state requirements. Some of the major changes that we looked at was to create the reasonable use exception, variances, and enforcement procedures to allow a little bit more flexibility to avoid a takings issue if a property had a substantial amount of critical areas. That with the buffer area might alleviate any potential development for that property, which is in a sense a taking. So we created through state allowances a reasonable use exception. One of the other things that was incorporated in the 2005 ordinance was that we needed to base our critical areas on the best available science. There was a lot of discussion when this first came out as to what exactly that best available science was. And it is basically what it says is the best available science created by professional technicians or engineers in that specific critical area. Whether it be geologically hazardous areas, geotechnical studies that may have been done with certain developments, or whatever professional credibility and certified documents that we could use to create our critical areas we needed to use. It says available science, and that's key because that doesn't mean we have to go out and create a science or do a study to produce whatever the most recent document is for that specific critical area. So that's important to keep in note. The other thing that Ordinance 1440 did was it restructured Title 20 to basically its current format. And I have the chapters as they're identified in our municipal code for Title 20 as part of your packet. The other thing that's important to note is while you'll see 4 of the critical areas in Title 20, the frequently flooded areas is actually housed in Title 17, which is the building title of our municipal code. And for obvious reasons, it's in the chapter for flood protection. It's the flood damage prevention. It's important to note when there's development that we need to know where the floodplain is so that the development is built in conformance with the requirements of that chapter for floodplain protection. It's also key as part of Ordinance 1440 that we use the protection mechanisms for function and value of the critical areas. Function is, for instance, a wetland where it creates wildlife habitat, it purifies the water system that goes through that system. That's a function. Of value is more of the aesthetics and recreational attributes of a critical area. So we needed to maintain that in our ordinances as we move forward. We did that in 1440. What we are going to be looking at for this effort is essentially making sure, as CAC mentioned, we are going to be looking at the environmental element again this year. We're going to make sure that we are consistent with our critical areas ordinance, along with the goals and policies established in the environmental element. We again will look at our best available science that we utilized back in 2005. Actually, we had a couple of consultants assist us with that 2005 effort, but we will look at what was used then. In fact, the 2005 model was based on the state model ordinance that they had created at the time. So we're in pretty good shape as far as we're concerned to this day. We'll look at recent legislation, whether there's been a lot of changes in critical areas. I don't know offhand how many there are. I don't think there are a lot. There is some recommended buffer width changes for wetlands from the Department of Ecology. We'll be looking at the flood hazard areas because, as Steve mentioned earlier, there's going to be some change in our flood insurance rate maps. As CAC identified in our update with our comprehensive plan, the Department of Commerce has a checklist that we can utilize to help us with our process as far as making sure, we're addressing all of those RCWs and points that the Department of Commerce would like to see in this update of our ordinance. And again, we're going to look at our critical area designations and regulations, make sure that we have our definitions consistent with the packet of definitions that we had with our low impact development. Just combine the two efforts, frequently flooded areas and then wetland buffers. Of course, we're going to be looking at critical aquifer for recharge areas. The county has some information that we're going to be looking at, making sure that that's still pertinent, and that our information is based on the best available science. As far as timing with this effort, we are looking at bringing back hopefully a draft to the March Planning Commission, and we'll move that forward to a public hearing in April, and then move your recommendation forward to the City Council for their review. Generally speaking, with the time I've spent looking at our ordinance, we're in pretty good shape. We don't have a lot of major amendments to this ordinance, so it's, knock on wood, it's probably not going to be that extensive of an effort like low-impact development was. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
For the audience, would you say that we would need to define the flood insurance rate map? That was in our pre-meeting. You made mention of it, that Steve had, if you follow what I'm saying, for the public.
It's a slightly different thing. While they are obviously related, the concept of a frequently flooded area from a critical areas perspective is clearly related to the flood insurance rate map. They are technically different documents, and so this effort and your effort won't touch on the flood insurance rate map. That'll be a separate thing that runs just through the council approval process. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
So when you talk about things like wetlands and the critical aquifer recharge areas and some of these other things, are you relying on things like the county maps that define what these are, or do you guys go out and do your own research?
We'll actually go to the state resources. In your packet, identified each critical areas in the state agency that's responsible for those, overseeing those different critical areas. We'll tap into the state resources. There's a lot of databases and information that the state provides. The challenge there is making sure that it's up-to-date information and not real antiquated. But that'll be one source that we will go to. And then also check around to see if there's any additional studies that are fairly decent that we can document as best available science.
So if the state or county doesn't necessarily define something as a wetland, are you liable to define it as a wetland or not?
Chances are unlikely that that would happen.
And I'm just curious, like on some of these geological events, like earthquakes, I mean, the whole sound is subject to earthquakes. Does the state somehow define what a significant hazard is?
They do. Actually, the Department of Natural Resources has a whole unit that deals with geologically hazardous areas, and they talk about where the potential for landslide hazards are, seismic zones, and that whole deal. In fact, there was a presentation made at a forum that we were able to attend a few months ago, and there's quite a bit of information out there that we can tap into and make sure that what we reflect is either updated or still current to the 2005 amendment.
So like right now, a normal member of the public can go to the county website and find out where the wetlands are, where the, all the critical area, what are they called? The critical aquifer recharge areas and all those things, and landslide areas, all those things are on there, but there's nothing about earthquakes on there.
Well, I would say our best source would be the state agencies. The county might be available for some of this information. I know they have critical aquifer recharge areas because they have a hydrogeologist on staff. But again, my first touch would be with the state agencies.
Do you mind if I chime in on that, Dennis, just a little bit?
Sure.
I think one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that one of the purposes of the critical areas ordinance is really when we're dealing with development applications.
Right.
So in that context, things like the potential for landslides, potential for liquefaction, those are things where we should have code that responds to that. Other than seismic zones and the attendant building code provisions with that, we don't really have specific regulations that are directly related to earthquake potential, right? And so we don't have to embody that in our critical areas code. The other thing is we do have maps as well in our comprehensive plan that are similar to the ones that the county has. And those give the citizen, the developer, the building permittee, an idea of where we think those critical areas are. But the site-specific analysis is where we figure out for sure, does it or doesn't have that particular feature. And so what these regulations do is they help us when we're on that site-by-site analysis, and they say, okay, well, if someone's gone through the process and yes, we've scientifically determined there's a wetland there, then these are the rules that are going to apply.
Gotcha.
That's sort of the connection between the big picture comp plan stuff. Is there generally something in that area? Oh, yes, maybe we need to pay attention to that. And then we figure it out through the site-specific analysis. Does it or doesn't exist?
Okay, thank you.
Any additional questions?
Good. Good report.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.
The final item on our agenda this evening is the sign code. It's a public meeting, and Associate Planner Ray Lindenburg will lead us through this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the commission, I am handing around or passing around a copy of the temporary sign matrix. It's what we've been kind of leading up towards for a while now. We've been discussing potential changes to our temporary sign code. So this is kind of where we're at right now. You can take a look at that as we go through it. I'll just do a brief presentation and we can discuss a little bit what we're looking at. As we've talked about before, and I won't go through all these slides so you don't have to read along, but we're looking at a new concept here, a form-based sign code that's based on the idea of form-based zoning. Rather than regulating signs by content, which is troublesome from constitutional standpoint, we're looking at size, location, and materials for what a sign is rather than what it says. We're not talking about radically changing what's in the sign code, where we're talking about changing the way that the sign code information is presented, essentially. So based on the signs that are existing in our sign code right now, we went through and came up with this matrix. These are kind of your graphical expression of sign types, and then the matrix provides that regulatory information to go along with it. So as you can see, this is kind of small and compressed on your page, so you can follow along in your actual packet there that I've handed out. But we've come up with a number of different sign types, and they're generally going to be kind of from large to small, and then there's the different types of flags and feather banners and things like that that are included in there. As you go from the top on down, what you see is an actual picture of what the sign is represented, what it looks like. The time limitation that sign may be located on a property. Again, these are all temporary signs. And then the number allowed per property or per frontage, and that is noted on that in that box there for each commercial, industrial, multifamily, single-family, public facility, or open space, or public right-of-way. So we're, again, restricting or regulating these by their location, not by their content. And then a location limitation that applies to all the signs in that note there, and then specifically a location on the property in each box of the matrix. So for instance, your type A sign, which is your 4x8 foot sign, kind of a typical construction announcement or political sign or something along those lines, would need to be located 10 feet from the front setback, at least 30 feet from any neighboring property. And that is a direct relationship of what's in our code now. Most of what you see here, 95% of what you see, comes straight out of our code. Some of it is an interpretation of the intent of the code or something along those lines. But most of what you see here is what we're dealing with already. Numbers of signs, sizes of signs, things like that. And then when you go through down at the bottom there, we talk about manner. Time, place, and manner is how we're restricting the signs. So the manner includes the materials and the installation, where it's located, things like that. So going through to page 2 there with your type D through F signs, You have your typical quote-unquote yard sign. I put kind of a common name under there in the red text. Not sure if that will remain in the actual code, but that's just a reference for myself to kind of have a common name for these signs rather than just saying a sign type B or whatever. So we have our typical yard signs. We have our ground banners. They're on a stake in the ground or stakes in the ground. And then we have our wall banners. Again, we have general limitations or general restrictions to what our signs are, and that will appear in a section in text before this matrix in the actual paper version or the copy of it. And some of those things will include the temporary sign is not to be lit, and it's to be maintained in good condition. It's not supposed to be falling apart and things like that. Typical, temporary sign regulations that are found in our code and will be found in this code just in a little bit different way. So moving on, we have on page 3 your A-frame type signs. We have 2 sizes there, typically reflecting what you might see in the city existing without talking about the content of them. You know where they're at. You've seen them downtown on Pioneer Way. You've seen them maybe out in a neighborhood, perhaps advertising something. So we can just go off of that and talk about the sizes and the locations instead. We also have light pole banners. The representation there are ones that hang free from the light pole, maybe a fabric piece or a flag or something along that line, or a one that is held at both ends, held more stiffly, or even a board or something along those lines. So those are regulated in slightly different ways. We allow the flag type one to be a little bit larger. And again, that is directly out of our existing code, these sizes and the limitations on those. Going on to page 4, you have your type J through L, which are your feather banner. Your ground flag is what I called that one, and that's generally what gets stuck in the little pipe holes along the sidewalk. And then also your pole flag, and that's more of a structural flagpole, if you will. And then finally, going on to the last page there, is your sign walker, and that's one I just added recently. It's one of those things that you do occasionally see. You have somebody holding a sign that's advertising something, or perhaps for a political candidate or something along those lines. We allow that there with the caveat that it must be handheld or attached to the body in some way and not stuck into the ground or left permanently there or semi-permanently. So based on that, we have, again, you can see that there's some additional space there, and that, I think, is one of the beauties of this setup. If we determine that there is a sign type that isn't in here that needs to be in there, it's easy enough to add one in. You add the graphic, you add the limitations, the numbers and things like that, and it's ready to go. It's not a huge ordeal to go through and add to this. It's flexible, and I think that's definitely one of the good things about it. So, moving on to the text pages there. Again, this is just kind of general standards for your temporary signs. There will be things that won't be able to be presented in the matrix. So there will be text included in this. It's not going to be all graphics or all within a chart there. So we have our general standards for temporary signs. You have your holiday displays for the months of October through December. That's essentially including your lights and your streamers and things like that may not be appropriate for the rest of the year, but are appropriate in a holiday display. Your general promotional periods, which we do allow. Again, this is straight out of our code. Grand openings, which do allow for additional flags and pennants and ribbons and things like that to allow a business to advertise more visibly during their grand opening period to help them kind of get off the ground there. And then I have some notes at the end on the last page there, just some general things to think about. Right now, we don't have any regulations for banners that are attached to stakes in the grounds, just ones that are on the building. So that ground banner type E that you saw in the matrix is new, but the regulations that I applied to that are very similar to the regulations that we have for a wall-mounted banner, just maybe a little bit different from a size standpoint, because at some point you have to say that there is a maximum size for a banner. So we included that in there. And then there are also some references in our current code to signs that are just slightly larger or a little bit taller than one of these types. For instance, there is an 18 square foot sign which is allowed. To me, that sounds like a little bit too much kind of fine tuning between a sign type. Maybe we can include that one in the 16 square foot size sign rather than having another separate sign category when you have a 2 square foot difference or a height difference of a couple feet or something along those lines. So that's one of the things I included there. It talks about a 32 square foot sign being allowed to a 12 foot height instead of a 10 foot height. Again, that seems to be a minor change that we could put into a single category without having to start kind of expanding out with all these different categories and things. On the ground, it will be very, very minor detail and not very noticeable indeed. So I kind of present this to you tonight with the idea that we can take a look at it here, or you can take it home with you, provide any insight, any ideas, play devil's advocate, think of, how you might use or abuse this sign code, and let me know, because that's what we're going to need to know. This is an entirely new thing. So this is going to require a little bit of creative thought and some, might be a little bit of growing pains with it, but we're going to try and make it as easy as possible for everybody. So what we have is, like I said, I went through the text portions, and then the basic discussion. Have we missed anything? Do we feel like there's any problem areas for temporary signs within the city? Do we think that there's too many of one type of sign or not enough of one type of sign? If there's if you have too many located in a certain place, is that certain place because it is a public right-of-way or a residential property or what have you? Kind of think about these sorts of things so we can really get into the details and start thinking about, okay, well, we can only allow one of these types of signs here because otherwise it's a problem here. So, and then taking on to the next steps, we're going to polish this draft temporary sign matrix. We're going to start working on the general requirements and that supporting text that will go along with it. And then we're going to start engaging our community stakeholders by soliciting comments, getting some public outreach, probably a public meeting or something along those lines. And hopefully we can have people really come out and give us some ideas. And like I said, play devil's advocate and see how this could be used and abused, because we want to make sure that we have everything tightened up before we kind of release it to the wild. So if you do have any comments or questions or anything, I'm happy to assist with that.
I don't see anything about electronic signs in here. Does that mean that there's not going to be any changes to the current code on that?
We are just working on temporary signs right now. Electronic signs are going to be all permanent.
On the part about general promotions, it refers to posters and windows.
Mm-hmm.
Is that anywhere else, posters and windows?
It's not.
Is that commercial now, posters and windows? And what's the length of time proposed?
30 days.
30 days.
For your general promotions are 30 days. And that's one of those things that I've seen in other sign codes is posters and windows and like window painting and things like that are generally held kind of separately. That's something that we can explore. If we feel like, window painting over a certain percentage of a window is okay, then maybe that's what we include in there. If we feel like it's a problem, then maybe not.
Why 30 days? Why not 60 days? Why not 90 days?
That's what's in our code now.
I understand
Yeah.
that, but I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah,
Okay.
and that's something we can certainly discuss.
Ray, one of the challenges I see is we have a restriction on the number of signs of each type, but I don't see anything that restricts the number of types of signs that we could have at any given point. So could I, as a resident, have one type A and one type D and one type F all at the same time in one location? I think there may need to be some kind of limiting factor to that. That's, I think, some way that somebody might try to abuse the code. But also along those same lines, as we get into political seasons and things, are we going to honestly restrict a resident to having one type D yard sign in their property and force them to choose which political candidate or which ballot measure they want to support the most? Maybe it makes a little more sense in my mind to have a restriction on the total square footage of sign that you could have. So maybe if we gave them 30 square feet, you can have, 4 type D signs or 1 type F sign and still fit within that total allowance. or potentially a total square footage per feet of frontage. I mean, just trying to think in a way that would give somebody some flexibility and not force them to be out of compliance, but still allow them to exercise their freedom of speech.
Or if you really can't make up your mind, 31 square foot.
Yeah. But I mean, if we could limit it in some way that gives them a little bit of flexibility, allows them to do the same things that they're doing now, but be in compliance.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, and that brings up a good point. And in answer to your question, the way it's set up now, that yes, you could have one of each of those things, and there probably does need to be an upper limit at
Some
some
limiting
point.
factor.
But what is that upper limit? And that's one of the things why we're going to go out to the public and say, what do you think? Because the main question is, it's a philosophical question. Do we have a sign problem in this city, or are we okay the way we are? Do we allow more? Do we allow less? So.
I think a lot of these questions that maybe we're thinking of right now, a lot more is going to come out of the citizens' comment and the business comments. You'll get a better feel
Yeah.
of where they want to be, where they're comfortable with. I know in our business district, Pioneer Way, you got narrower properties, and if all of a sudden you started having 6 foot by 3 foot wide A-frame signs in front of every one, it kind of becomes a blight. And so we just need to be, aware that there's that possibility. And this is some of the things I think will come out of the public comment.
I know one of the things that I sit there and see is, one of the problems is on easements and stuff. You'll have an easement in front of a house where somebody will, not saying the homeowner, but somebody will sit there and put the sign on the easement, and then the homeowner is gonna put his on there, on his own property and stuff where there is no easement. And then that's gonna be confusing to some people. It's gonna have to be explained, well, one's an easement and one's not.
Yeah, and that's a good distinction. That's one of the things we struggled with allowing signs in the public right-of-way, is if we can restrict the person who's adjacent to that portion of the public right-of-way, if they can determine who's allowed to put a sign there, because it's the public right-of-way. So there's definitely some massaging and some fine-tuning to be done here, because we don't want to have a situation where we're trying to get away from being unconstitutional in one way and then step into another one and be in the same situation. So we're definitely going to try to avoid that, make sure we have everything properly vetted.
We can't restrict public right-of-way, is that correct? We
We-
can't say no signs in public right-of-way?
We can either say that, well, I guess I'll leave that to you. I don't remember exactly what Nikki's final answer was on that.
It is a traditional public forum. And so with that designation, very, very challenging for us to say that we couldn't allow signs there because of its traditional use as a public forum.
Fair enough.
I think the only possible way is if we said there were no temporary signs anywhere throughout the community,
Yeah.
which is, not likely given where we've been in the past.
I do have another question as far as dealing with easements. If it was different easements, say one was the city for an easement for something and one was for the electrical company, for the cable company, is that all considered one easement, or is that different easements, or?
Would you like me to answer?
Go ahead.
State highway.
So, just maybe as a point of clarification, most of the things that we have in the city actually are in the form of right-of-way. So,
Okay.
so when Ray's talking about right-of-way in this context, those are covering the vast majority of our public streets in that land area of varying widths on either side of the improved public street. Inside of that right-of-way, there may be easements, but normally it's within the right-of-way. On the private property side, there may be other easements that run across that. Typically, there are utility easements, but the underlying property is private property. And so for the purposes of our code, we're going to look at it from a private property standpoint or a public right-of-way standpoint. And that'll be our line of demarcation.
Okay, I'm just saying, because I heard one time, and I don't remember where or anything like that, that somebody could place a sign on an easement, and there's nothing that the homeowner could do. You know, if that's wrong, then I'm very
Well,
glad that it's wrong.
I think really what it is probably referencing more the right-of-way.
Okay.
And the reason that that's kind of confusing is we have lots of places in town where the right-of-way might be 60 feet, but the actual street improvements are significantly less than that. And so an area that looks like it's part of your yard is actually the public right-of-way. And so right. You just have the honor and privilege of taking care of that right-of-way for us. But when people put signs there, those are actually most typically in the public right-of-way and not within an easement. And that might be where somebody is saying that situation that you're referring to.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, the state highway, I think, has a wide easement in some cases. I
It
mean,
does. So
30 feet, 40 feet,
Well, actually,
for lane
for
of
instance,
traffic or more.
For instance, the right-of-way width is, when we get north of the Goldie Road Midway intersection at the highway, the right-of-way is 150 feet in width. Clearly, the actual improvements are nowhere near that width. So a good portion of that area that you see that's grass or landscaping alongside of the highway is actually state right-of-way.
Any other questions? Thank you, Ray.
Thank you.
I'm sure we'll all hear more later. Just a reminder that the next regular business meeting of the Planning Commission will be February 28. Seeing no further business, I call the meeting adjourned.